This video will introduce hypothesis testing framework. Remember back in chapter 2, we saw an experiment about gender discrimination. In the experiment, people were recruited to participate, and each person evaluated a resume to determine whether the person whose resume it was should be promoted or not. All of the resumes were exactly the same, except for half of the participants saw the resume identified with a male name, and half of the participants saw the resume with a female name. What we saw is that among those who saw the resume with a male name on it, 88% felt that the person should be promoted. Among those with a female label, 58% said they felt the person should be promoted. So this was a difference in proportions of about 30% or 0.3. Now, there were a couple of possible explanations. One was that promotion and gender are independent of each other, that there's no gender discrimination, and the observed difference in proportions was simply due to chance. That is what we call the null hypothesis, that there's nothing interesting going on, status quo. The other possible explanation is that promotion and gender are dependent and that there is gender discrimination, and that the observed difference in proportions is not due to chance. This is the alternative hypothesis. In order to decide how consistent we think the data are with this null hypothesis and how strongly they support the alternative hypothesis, we used a simulation method to look at the kinds of differences that might occur due to chance if the null hypothesis were true and gender and whether or not people were recommended for promotion really were independent. What we saw is that the sample proportion, the difference in the sample proportions was 0.3, which is here, and that was very unlikely to have happened if in reality there's no true difference in the chance that a person's going to be recommended for promotion based on their gender. So since it was unlikely that we'd obtain results like the actual data, a difference of 0.3, or more extreme, we decided to reject the null hypothesis in favor of the alternative. This is the framework for hypothesis testing. So we're going to use this common hypothesis testing framework. We'll start by using the research question to formulate our hypotheses. The null hypothesis, which we denote H sub 0, represents the status quo. The alternative hypothesis is the one that we're trying to support, and we denote that one H sub A. After formulating the hypotheses, we determine the chance that we would observe our actual sample data under the assumption that the null hypothesis is true. This is referred to as the p-value for the test. We'll then make a decision regarding whether the p-value indicates strong enough evidence to reject the null hypothesis. And finally, we'll explain the conclusion of the hypothesis test in context so that someone who doesn't know much about statistics can understand what our findings are. In section 5.3, we're going to formalize this hypothesis testing process with a focus on testing hypotheses about a single proportion.